Welcome to Elevating Consciousness, the podcast that helps you discover deeper levels of truth, meaning, and wholeness. I'm your host, Artem, and today's guest is an all-around Renaissance man. He plays many roles, including author, poet, storyteller, cultural activist, and farmer. He received a master's in theology from Harvard and a master's in social work from the University of Toronto. He is the subject of a film called Griefwalker, which documents his experience as a palliative care worker. He has written a handful of books, including the award-winning Die Wise, which explores our culture's relationship to dying. Stephen Jenkinson, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
So before we begin, I just want to set a little bit of context.
Okay.
I probably really started to think about death about 4 to 5 years ago. This was probably around the same time when I started to use psychedelics. And in particular, my experience with this one compound, 5-MeO-DMT toad venom, it's been nothing less than like a full-blown ego death experience. And I don't know what physical death would be like, but I imagine that the most uncomfortable part of the death is ego dissolution, which may be similar to some of these psychedelic experiences.
It'd be a challenge.
So the first time I used the 5-MeO-DMT was probably around October 2017. And the following month, my grandfather passed away. And the month after that, my grandmother passed away. So here I was after this radically like life-altering ego death experience, thinking about my own death. And then I was watching my grandparents dying. And while they were dying, it seemed like everyone was in denial. My grandfather was in the nursing home and they kept trying to feed him, even though he had no appetite. Mm-hmm. I could see it on the faces of the nurses and the doctors that it wasn't looking good, yet no one would dare say that he was dying. And then my mom kept trying to feed him all these vitamins and remedies. And it seemed like there was this whole conspiracy to save him. And everyone was acting like he would be all right. But to me, it was obvious that he was dying. Mm. And then it was a similar thing with my grandmother the following month when we found out she had terminal pancreatic cancer. And they said she had maybe a month to live. And it was this big secret, like we were supposed to keep from my grandmother. Like, once again, vitamins, enemas, all of these things to try to help her when it was obvious to me that she was also dying.
That's a good frame. Vitamins, enemas. Those are good two poles, which everything happens between. Yeah.
Yeah. And you know, my experience of all of this was like something is terribly wrong. It's like no one was prepared for this process. It's like we're going to fight till the end and the person might die, but there's no room for the dying process. And we're not going to speak openly about it. We'll just keep pretending like the person isn't dying because maybe that will save them. And that whole orientation it didn't feel right for me. So then over the last year, I've read your powerful and poetic book, Die Wise, and it really helped me make sense of those experiences and see how unprepared and unaccepting of death we are as a culture. And I'm just really interested, what is it that made you want to work with death and the dying?
I didn't. In fact, I had no understanding that there was such a thing as a dedicated field of practice called, as they call it, end of life care and the rest. By the way, there's no such thing as end of life. I mean, let's just get this on the table right away. You think of the phrase end of life. We succumb to that phrase, but we don't think about it much. But let's start with the word life. What does it include? Well, it includes the flowers, the trees, the bees. Okay, good. Anything else? Does it include, for example, what used to do, have a pulse and no longer does? Does it include everything that we don't recognize as particularly alive, given the fact that we're inanimate in our core as North Americans? Does it include the dead? Does it include death, life? I mean, people will say that once you point it out, but there's a lot of Puritanism around what should be properly included in living, right? That's not living. That's not life, you hear people say, as if there's certain things that that are beyond the dignity of life to have to endure. For example, like perhaps what's going on in Ukraine right now. But I don't think anybody in Ukraine would say, I shouldn't presume. Let's just imagine that the most intact amongst those people have the capacity to say, this also is life as it happens now. It is in some sense a living death, but that's not the opposite of life. This is the rest of life that very few of us would sign up for or conspire with, right? Okay, so if life is everything, it's a synonym for everything, then what does this after mean in the phrase afterlife? End of life. It's the end of someone's living. That's correct. But it's not the end of life. I mean, we have ample evidence that it's not the end of life, no matter how many lives end. Yeah? Okay, so it's proper to allow the breadth of life, its proper claim upon us and our imagination, I think, and be willing to say, there's no such thing as end of life. There are the ends of lives, and life includes them. Life is not annihilated or eclipsed by those endings. Life is in some sense fulfilled and sustained by those endings. And of course, that's what dirt is, right? It's the sustaining end of things that agreed to the completion of their allotment by dying. And so the scenario you've described in the nursing home and so forth, this is an indication of a lot of North American people's willingness to go to plan B, let's say, anything but endings. And if there were anything that you could characterize as anti-life and therefore perhaps really the end of life, maybe it's our unwillingness to count ourselves among the living and pay down the life debt that incurs when our time comes. Maybe that's end of life. The unwillingness to live the full breadth of what life not only bestows upon us, but asks of us finally also. Short of that, there is so far no such thing as end of life, thankfully. You see, in other words, what I'm pointing out here is if we use stock phrases and we don't think about them, then we find, or maybe we don't really overly discover, and somebody has to point out, that the language that we employ determines how we think about things. It's not the other way around. It's not like you think your thoughts and then you go about choosing words like wildflowers in the field. That's not how it works, man. The way it works is exactly what you just did, that you troll for the words, you string them on a line, and that becomes your sentence. But you don't invent the words, right? So the best you can do as an heir to the language is exercise a high degree of alertness to the kind of charge, if you will, that language induces in us. You know, we leap from meaning to meaning without really acknowledging what kind of part we play in perpetuating those things. When they're benign, we call them habits. Not so benign, they're prejudices.
Yeah. Our metaphors definitely shape our lives, and it's so important, like what metaphors we hold in our minds. And I think it's interesting to look at how much of our fear of death is biological and how much of it is cultural.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's a good question, but I'm not sure that that separateness that the question implies necessarily belongs. You know, the difference between biological and cultural. Are these in some sense, as they visit us, what are they? It's a kind of continuum, isn't it? Partly of influence, quote unquote, from the outside, partly of inheritance, which is slightly more from the inside, partly a sense of what endures, partly a sense of what you have to work very hard at to perpetuate. So, I mean, I think by biological, you mean inevitable. maybe this is another word, that the fear of death, if it's biological, if it's part of the circuitry, is by definition unavoidable. And if it's unavoidable, maybe it's natural. And if it's natural, well, then maybe it belongs. And if it belongs, maybe we could make room for it instead of trying to prevail against it, or treat it, or medicate it, or alternative drug use it away, or whatever it is. And if it's cultural, apparently it's, I'll just finish the thought and then please go ahead.
Yeah.
And if it's cultural, what are we saying? Are we saying that it's arbitrary? Are we saying it's unnecessary? Are we saying it's not part of the circuitry? Are we saying it's debatable, negotiable, that there are legitimate alternatives to it, that it has no inherent place, and in that sense doesn't really belong? Usually when you set up those two poles in a question like that, that's what's feeding the thinking about it, right? So in pointing this out, one of the things I'm trying to elucidate here is, when it comes to meaning, we are mostly on the receiving end of what things mean. Even though your generation in particular is very keen on the idea that you're in some genius mode, making meaning as you go. But the enduring truth of the arrangement is that the meaning precedes you, you see, or the meanings, I should make it plural. They precede you, and what you're doing is somewhat unconsciously moving through the meanings and picking them up as they suit you and casting them aside when they don't. Yeah. So etymology, the proper study of the language you're employing, is immensely helpful as an antidote to the sense that you are the genius maker of the life that you inhabit. Yeah. And I should say, as a PS to that, it's a good habit to break when you still have the choice of doing so, because if you come to your dying time as the kind of supreme architect of what you think you're holding dear, you will discover, frankly, too late, that your addiction to competence and mastery and the rest will not serve you well when the god of dying is sitting at the foot of your bed.
Yeah, that really resonates, the addiction to competence and mastery, and that something that I feel like I grapple with. When I feel like things are clicking in my mind and things are going my way, and I generally feel good. And then when I'm in this space of kind of not knowing or uncertainty, or it's just like, what is going on? And that to me is that's the feeling of dying. It is that kind of sense of losing control. And the thing that when I was interrupting, I'm sorry for interrupting.
No,
What I wanted to ask is because when we were talking about death being inevitable, like it's inevitable, it's something that's going to happen, but is the fear of death, like, do we have to have a fear of death? Is that something that's necessary, or is that something that's taught? So that's what I kind of meant by the biological and cultural thing. Biological being innate, more innate, and cultural being more of how we're nurtured and what we're taught.
Right.
So
yeah, I think I got you. I think I got you. And I think in the answer, I was speaking to those things. But I should say that since you're talking to me about this, my response to the notion that death is inevitable is, oh no, it's not at all. Once you operationalize what you mean by this word death, if you think that death is what happens to you, if you think you're on the receiving end of death, if you think you have no principal part to play except victim or recipient or dupe, if you think that's the arrangement, which of course, frankly, most people in North America seem to see it exactly that way, then certainly the the fear thing is a big part of the circuitry now, isn't it? And you would think that dying is inevitable. And if you think dying is inevitable, here's one thing it will never be to you: an accomplishment. Nothing inevitably occurring in your life would you ever view as an accomplishment, as something to attain, and therefore as something to learn, and something to practice, and something to be good at. None of those thoughts would occur if you thought dying was inevitable. So this is a good time to bring in a grammar lesson. Now, English grammar is just a torment, even for English speaking people, right? But this is a useful thought, I think. So we have the verb to die, which we all, quote, understand what it means. Okay, good. So let's do this. I'm going to ask you, if you would, be so kind as to use the verb to die in the passive voice in a sentence, in proper English. Give it a shot.
I don't believe we could do it. I think that's something you mentioned in your book.
Yeah, you were studying, man, so you know that that's a setup, right? It's a shell game on the corner, what I just did, right? But it's designed, it's very purposeful. Here's why. Grammatically speaking, you're right. You can't use the verb to die in the passive voice in a proper sentence in the English language. Why? Well, the English language won't allow you to do it. You might think you can do it. You might be able to think of dying in the passive voice, but you can't actually say it that way. Good God Almighty, does that do anything to your, does it turn you into a cartoon character, sort of shaking your head, trying to clear things? And I should think so. So the English language, for all its mongrel status in the world, has some rather bracing wisdom on the matter of dying, doesn't it? And it's saying to you, dying by grammatical definition, and therefore as an existential reality that responds to language, is not something that happens to you. You can't even formulate a sentence wherein that's true. It is by definition, grammatically speaking, something that you do. It's only an active verb. This is an amazing realization, I think. At least I should say, you can tell years later, after I stumbled upon this, I'm still amazed by it. I'm still glad that it's there. I'm still glad that it's smarter than me. And it pointed this out to me. Yeah. So if dying is what you do, and it's not what happens to you, what does it mean about the phrase that dying is inevitable? This is what it means. If dying is what you do, now you know it's possible not to do it. It's possible to fail to do it. It's possible to refuse to do it. It's possible to opt out from doing it. It's possible not to know that it's something that you do and therefore you don't do it. Now, we're not talking about your respiration expiring. Obviously, that will happen. That's not what you do. But I think we're using the word die here in a kind of whole person, not only semantic reality, but a kind of psychic, spiritual, mythic, and poetic reality, a whole person, whole body event, right? Okay. If that's what it is, then you begin to realize, I think, that there's a lot of work that attends to a living being undertaking some education about its or his or her death. It is indeed something you do. And your failure to realize that is going to have severe consequences as you lay there waiting for the big one.
What do you believe that people are most afraid of? No, what do people believe that they're most afraid of when it comes to death, and what are they really afraid of?
Yeah. Well, you know, this is a bit of a gotcha question, isn't it? In the sense that what do people think they're afraid of and what are they actually afraid of? And of course, in so doing, you're pointing out some deep running error in a lot of dying people's take on their dying, which is not the most fashionable thing to say. We should, before I answer your question properly, I should just acknowledge that there is a running gag in the dominant culture of North America that goes like this: dying people are hip. Dying people, they get it. Dying people are down with their crazy life. Dying people can't be fooled. Dying people have got it figured out. You understand what I'm saying? That there's some kind of practical wisdom that ensues as a result of a terminal diagnosis that the rest of us are just floundering without. Okay, you can tell by the way I'm saying this. Dude, I never saw that. I was there for a long time. I never saw a terminal diagnosis turn somebody into a spiritual genius. If I did, I'd be happy to report that to you, but I never saw it. So that's a big deal, right? So what do people come into their dying time in Anglo North America? We should, be clear that overly generalizing doesn't help anybody. But in Anglo North America, what I found is people principal fear going in was the pain, the unthinkable, unmitigated, untreatable 3 a.m. Sleepless, in the grip of a midnight terror that you cannot resolve. That was the principal fear, and properly so. I mean, we all get that, hopefully, right? And it's nothing to sneeze at. It's nothing to sneer about. But what I'm saying to you is that given the skill that the doctors I work with had in terms of pain management and all the rest, that scenario almost never came to pass. So here's a math formula. If dying people's worst fears never came to pass, I never doesn't mean absolutely, but generally speaking, never came to pass, right? That sounds like it's a recipe for good dying. If your fears never materialize, surely to God, you're on the upside, on the upswing. It's basically goodness and mercy from here on out. And if that were true, you and I wouldn't be talking about this, because there'd be nothing to report except another fine day at the palliative care unit. That's all we'd have to say, where everything's unfolding as it should and everybody's good. But that's not a palliative care unit, not in Anglo North America. It's full of people who are writhing, with an unspoken and often unspeakable low-grade terror that never breaks the surface of speech, never comes to the attention of the attendees and the professional caregivers, and even of the families. See, and it turns into, quote, a diagnosis of depression or a diagnosis of dissociative state mania or whatever it is. I'm telling you, I took a long time to look at this, and it wasn't fun. And I'm here to faithfully report to you that the reason that good death never abounded from good pain and symptom management is because principally people were wrong about what they were most afraid of. They didn't know they were wrong, and often they never discovered that they were wrong. But they were, because there was something else, something that never drew much attention to itself. And my best way of expressing it is this: their great undigested, undiagnosed, and unsought fear was what was to become of them after they died. Not in terms of what happens next and are there red lights on the left and green lights on the right, not that kind of guided tour thing, but really and truly, it was this. They feared most the distinct possibility bordering on likelihood that they, as a consequence of their demise, would disappear more or less without a trace in fairly short order from among the living. That last part is a big one, because it's actually, this fear is a consequence of how the people around them were likely to proceed in the wake of their death, which they themselves were alert to. Why? Because they were so prescient about the future? Nope. It's because they finally realized that when, in all the deaths in their life that preceded their own oncoming death now, virtually each and every time, they practiced this strange incantation called getting on with your life, right? Of closure, right? That they practiced that. They got on with their lives after a fitting time of disturbance or grief or missing or whatever it was. And they got rid of the clothing from the closet, didn't they? And they turned the page, didn't they? And perhaps they remarried, didn't they? or were happy with the kids that survived, didn't they? And so on and so on. And yes, there was a little bit of like a phantom limb syndrome from time to time regarding the person who had died. But by and large, the mania of the culture to proceed and to progress and to grow no matter what had them by the short hairs for the balance of their life. And that's why they knew by the time they came into their own dying time, the likelihoods were very good that the whole import and consequence of their lives would disappear without a trace, slip below the surface of the ordinary day of the people who were still alive in their passing. You see, intuitively, they knew how easy it was in our way of life to lose the dead, because we actually use the phrase, don't we? As if it were a synonym for dying. I lost so-and-so. The way we do it, you bet you did. That was their great fear. And virtually nobody ever said that to me, right? So you might say, okay, wise guy, is this just you talking? Or, I mean, how do you know if nobody ever told you this? Okay, thanks for asking. I'll give you an example of where it came from. So by that time, this sort of mini digital technology was beginning to appear. Small phones and all the rest, small screens. And people were beginning to make these home movies. That's what I'll call them. And most of you who are listening to this know what I'm referring to. A home movie, a person sets up either a screen or a mic or both, and they begin to dispense a kind of timeless and rather banal, if I may put it this way, wisdom that's supposed to ensue as a result of them reflecting upon the ending of their days and so forth. And I don't mean to sound cynical, but it's like suffering through a lot of wedding speeches, you know? The truth of the matter is they're not that great. There's not a lot of wisdom there. But okay, it's just no problem. Relax your standards and get through it. Okay, it's not a problem. But here's the thing. I would routinely ask them why they're making the videos. And they would look at me like I'm a simpleton. I can't figure it out on my own. I have to be told. I do have to be told. This is how I found out what the greatest fears are, you see. So why are you making these home movies? Oh, so they can play them at, you know what, I won't be at my kid's wedding, right? So they'll play this instead and everybody will cry and it'll be a thing, you know, and I'll be able to speak from beyond the grave. Right. Okay. Well, the film will, as long as they don't lose it. Yes. But that's what you're hoping for. But I'm wondering why you need to make a movie in order to see to it that you'll have a presence at this event that you're not going to live long enough to see. That's what I'm wondering. And at which point it's a much harder question to answer. And so I'll give you the general answer that came forward. I'm not persuaded that without my influence, without my say-so, and without my little movie, I am going to have any presence at those events that I won't live long enough to see. Because it's asking too much of the people who claim to love me to really actively remember me day in and day out. And so on these high water events, I'm just going to ask them to press play instead. And that's a confession, man. That's a confession about a degree of cultural poverty that borders on the unspeakable and, to a certain degree at least, terrifying. That's how I know.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that story and how you kind of had to decipher and read between the lines, because people aren't going to tell you straight up, but just you watching the pattern and you watching what people say, right, that like it's so clear hearing you say that story. And now I'm just wondering, you know, you say this in your book, that you have this phrase, you say carry the dead, right? And I'm just wondering what that process looks like, what that could look like for us. You know, when you go to a wedding and somebody passed away, like my uncle passed away, you know, he died in an accident some years ago, 5, 6, 7 years. Don't even know at this point how many years it's been. You know, but yeah, for sure. But you know, like my cousin got married, his son,
Yeah.
and he brought up his name, saying that, I mean, my father is not here, but he's with us in spirit. And obviously we say these things, we bring up these people that passed, we bring up the people that passed away.
Right.
But what is it? How do we transform that? What is it? Is it something where it's like we hold these people with us all the time? That's what I seem to not understand, or not understand how to do that, because it's like, we remember people. Like, I remember my grandma and my grandfather, and I think about them from time to time, but I don't do it every single day, or I don't do it all the time. So what does it look like for us to carry the dead? What does it look like for us to transform this relationship that we have?
It's an understandable question, and it's a good one to ask. Just tell me what the template would look like, and then presumably you'll get with the program and you'll do it more or less immediately, right? Okay, so let's work backwards from the way it is. Let's not work backwards from the way it should be, okay? So the way it is the way it is. Why? Because this is the best we can do, because we've never thought of anything else, because there's no other culture in the world to give us an alternative to the way we do things, because we don't get out, because we don't watch a little screen that tells us what people in other corners of the world are doing. You understand what I'm saying? What I mean by this is, man, this is very mysterious, that the most materially prosperous culture that the world has ever seen is so mythically and culturally impoverished at the same time, with all kinds of opportunity to proceed otherwise, and an ongoing failure to do so. This is WTF land, isn't it? How can this possibly be? At the surface, it doesn't seem to make any sense at all, until you start taking a page, well, from the crackheads playbook, or from the junkies playbook, or from any addict's playbook. They know that the addiction doesn't serve them well, don't they? They know this, okay? And what does that knowledge do? Well, beyond convicting them from time to time and filling them with self-hatred, it doesn't do very much, because the addiction is a heavy hand, right? Okay, so the realization that it's not good for you doesn't translate into proceeding otherwise, not usually. Okay, so might we have in the Anglo-West an addiction or two that we can't get over? Could it be? Maybe more than one or two? Maybe by the handfuls? Okay, and could these addictions begin to inform our understanding of, we proceed in this kind of bizarre, self-generated way of living as Anglo-North Americans? Don't we? We proceed as if we're the boss. We proceed as if we call the shots. We proceed as if it's our life. It's literally our possession to dispose of as we see fit. And so, of course, suicide is a right, isn't it? And euthanasia is a right as well. And the freedom from suffering becomes a right. And before you know it, I mean, we're surrounded by these rights that aren't doing us any good, even when we resort to them. That it doesn't deepen the culture, that it doesn't make our life lived in the presence of our ancestors any more real than it was before all these rites and ayahuascas and everything else. It ain't working. Why? Because it puts the emphasis on the wrong syllable. That's why. Because what it says is how you are is the most important thing. And the collective or the greater good will have to wait until you get your shit sorted out. Right? And the rest of us are going to have to shoulder the heavy work while you're in individual psychotherapy for God knows how long, while you're checking out. Okay, it's a little heavy-handed what I'm saying, but the point I'm making is this. What would it look like? It's not hypothetical what it would look like if we lived in the presence of our dead, because there are people who do it. A few of them are in our midst, just by the way. They were here first, just by the way. Not all of them. They're not doing any better than the rest of us as a group. But indigenous people had indigenous ways of living before the European onslaught. and it included an ongoing lived relationship with their dead, to the point where they would speak of the dead in the present tense. You speak of the dead in the present tense, except for the odd wedding, people are going to look at you sideways pretty quickly. You know it's true. So the only time you get to talk that way is in these high watermark events, high emotional expressivity events, right? But an ordinary day, you're supposed to leave that shit behind. In order to be what? In order to be as psychically and spiritually alone as the guy beside you. That's what, that's the standard. So that nobody feels like you got something figured out and you got a depth to your life that nobody else has. Because nobody's going to tolerate that from you. You hear what I'm saying? You know it's true. All right. So sadly, our isolation works. I mean, we can put one foot in front of the other and live without our dead. Obviously we can. But certain times of life come around and you wonder about that for a minute, or you go through the motions of, you know, figures of speech, like he's with us in spirit. Okay. How about Saturday when you're bitching out somebody in a road rage incident? Your father with you now? Is he? Is any of that stuff real now? Because it doesn't suit you? Because you're the boss right now of how you're behaving? I tell you this for what it's worth. Not that I got any of this stuff figured out to my complete satisfaction. I'll tell you this. My grandfather, he was not physically any bigger than I am now, but you know, nothing, 5'7" and nothing, basically. But he occupied this terrain in my inner life. He was gargantuan. He was just a titan, as most grandfathers should properly be. And there were moments where he scared the bejesus out of me, but mostly I wanted to be him. So it's a mix, right? Okay. And he died. And I remember exactly where I was when I found out. I was on the stairs coming up from the basement, and a neighbor lady came in and had received the call and passed it along to us. And I remember in the weeks and months that ensued, I had the distinct feeling every time I was engaged in some kind of, let's call it involuntary or basically unconscious behavior. I had the distinct sense that my grandfather was he's just doing this from wherever he was, however it worked, you know, he was just doing this, not condemning, just observing me in the most neutral and in a sense, loving fashion. And he was giving my behavior back to me by letting me see it through his eyes. And in so doing, giving me a choice next time. Do I still want to do that? Do I still want to behave that way? Do I still want to see things like that? Now, some people could say, hey, you're just using a memory you had of your grandfather. And okay, tell me there's a difference between doing that and the dead being with you. As far as I can tell, I can't figure out the difference either. Here's the PS on the story. I know this is a long one, but it's a good question, right? So it deserves a fulsome answer. So some years ago, I'm downtown. These are in the old days when you could go to a restaurant. And went to a Chinese restaurant and walked in. And right in front there, they had all these bouquets of flowers and banners in Chinese and stuff. And I think the guy I was with, he asked the proprietor, what's with all the stuff there, which we equate with funerals, that kind of floral wreaths and stuff like that. He said, oh, that's good wishes from our friends for prosperity and so on. Oh, yeah, okay. So we went and sat down. And my friend is starting to riff off of this. Oh, the Chinese always thinking about a buck. And, you know, off he went on this whole tangent, right? And they're angling for success all the friggin' time. They're the ultimate entrepreneurial immigrants, right? Wherever they go. And I'm listening to him and I'm nodding. I'm thinking, this is going bad fast, right? Because there's a lot of prejudice in what he's saying. And so I'm thinking, how might I respond? So I said, you know, and there's the thing. Did you see what's in the front there? They had the little dish and they had some rice in the dish. And then there was an orange there and 3 sticks of incense, right? It was just kind of sitting there. Yeah. He said, what's that? I said, well, I don't know for sure, but I think it's an altar. An altar, he said. Yeah, I said, I think that's what it is. And the reason they don't torch up the incense is because, oh, you know, sensitivities these days. And of course, the lawyers won't let them have anything lit at the front of the place. But I think it's for their dead. What? He said. I said, yeah, I think that's how it works. He said, but what happens to that orange after a couple of days? You telling me the dead eat it? I said, I don't know. He said, no, I'll tell you what happens. It ends up in the dumpster out back. Yeah, so much for your dead and all that whole thing. I said, yeah, and then what happens in the dumpster? Well, it either goes rotten or the raccoons get to it. He said. I said, yeah, you know, I said, I got the same problem as you. He said, what do you mean? I said, I can't tell the difference between the dead and a raccoon either. See? What's my point? The point is, there are mysteries afoot, man. Don't think everything should shake down the way you think it should shake down, and that's the only explanation there is. So could it not be that the onset of mold in an orange offered up to the dead is not the dead's presence in this world, taking its nutrition where and how it can? Could it be? You come up with a better story. That's not a bad story. And even if it's not true, should be. That's what it looks like. Day in and day out in a place that really lived it out. That's what it would look like. It doesn't mean in those places everybody's got it figured out. I don't think. I think what it means is their culture lends them, let's call it a working person's understanding of how these things go. That's called tradition. And these people don't throw tradition under the bus because they're embarrassed about their ancestry and so on, at least not until we get a hold of them and try to modernize them, right? And as long as they're not too modernized or too missionized, how are they with the times that were before them? And the answer is, well, they're not neither pro nor con. It's something else. It's something like an understanding that were it not for those who came before, they themselves would not be. So what kind of a circuitry of obligation and a sense of deep identity? What kind of a sense of those things does that send up? I think an enormously life-giving kind. Yeah. So we got a lot of work to do, right? Which is why I'm taking so much time to answer your question carefully. We got a lot of work to do, man. It's not impossible to do, but my God, it's uphill. It's really uphill.
Yeah, it seems like really transforming the stories and the narratives that are embedded in so many of our psyches, and just broadening and expanding our understanding of who we are as people. And
if you don't start in the dumpster, okay, you're never going to end up in the restaurant. That's the point. So, you know, I understand your language of transforming and broadening and increasing, but that's not the language I'm employing. The thing I'm pleading for is something much closer to, you got to begin with the poverties. You got to be versed in the impoverishments that you're on the inheriting end of, and therefore on the practicing end of. Because without that, all the broadening and learning and growing, all of it will end up, you know, way out there at the edge of what you actually are living. And it'll stay there, like one of them self-storage units on the edge of town for all your stuff. That's what it'll be, right? So you got to start with the most inconvenient stuff. Why is it not working? Why is it crazy? Why is it empty? Why can't we tell a difference between a dead ancestor and a raccoon in the dumpster?
Have you ever met people that weren't dealing with a terminal illness or lying on their deathbed, but you felt that they deeply understood that they can die at any moment, that life and death aren't separate, that it's not so much of a separation, it's kind of intertwined, that they're living and dying is happening at the same time? And if so, what was it about them that was different, or how did they live different, or what was the sense that you got?
That's good. That's a good one. You can see I'm looking off in the middle distance trying to remember. because that's how uncommon an experience it is, right? How can you tell? I'll restate your question slightly. How can you tell that somebody knows that they're going to die?
Mm-hmm.
There.
Yeah.
How can you tell? Okay, so let's start with an example of something else first and see if we can apply it to dying. I'm old enough to remember, you certainly have heard of it, although you're too young to know it firsthand. So-called oil crisis. I think it was in the mid 80s or so, mostly in your country there. And fist fights at the gas pumps, the whole crazy 9 yards. Nobody ever imagined they'd ever see such a thing, and they were seeing it. And lineups down the block and so forth. Get ready, buckle up, because those days could well be coming again, just now because of the sanctions against Russia and the rest. Okay. So that's the time I'm thinking about, and I'm thinking about your question, and here's the application. Could you tell in those days that people knew that there was enough oil for everybody forever and ever? Amen. Could you tell that people knew that? Answer is, you certainly could tell. How could you tell? Just observe their behavior, especially their buying behavior. Were they buying the big cars? You know they were. There's no compact car time. That was later. But in those days, people were continuing to buy everything that needed there to be a infinite amount of gas and oil in the ground and in the tank. That's how you could tell. Now, if you're listening carefully, you could say, but that was never true, man. It was never true there was enough to live that way. I didn't say it was true. I said we knew it. There's a difference, right? We knew something that wasn't so. And you could tell by our behavior that we knew it. Now, take out oil and gas from the story and plunk in dying and ask yourself, is there anything in the behavior of the people that you see every day that tells you that they know beyond any shadow of a doubt that they're going to die? Do they know that you're going to die? Can you tell by how they are with you that they know? Is there anything that carries this understanding forward and makes it an ongoing reality instead of something we think about on occasion when circumstances around us force us to do so? And the answer probably is, I can't even think what the criteria would be by which I could identify somebody like that, which is why you've asked me the question. Okay, so what does it mean? I suspect it means this. Most people don't know. That's number one. Number two, for those people who do know, they may not have the chops to live that out, because it's not like they're surrounded by an enabling culture who helps them figure that stuff out and proceeds accordingly. And thirdly, if you know that you're going to die and you go to a party, man, I'm telling you, you're not likely to be popular, because your ability to talk shit with strangers, if I may just put it this way, takes a hit when you know that you're going to die. Because one of the things you're wondering is, why? Why am I talking this drivel? Why am I just passing the time of day? Why am I trying to score or hit on somebody? What's it for? Now, the PS on what I'm saying is this. It might sound to people who are listening to this right now as if I'm saying, oh my God, once you realize you're going to die, it's just your life is an ongoing disaster that you can never redeem. I'm not saying that. I'm describing the transitional moment when you go from you didn't know this to you do. First order of business is you don't know how to translate it at all. Second order of business is the life you've been living up until now starts to look a little paltry and a little misshapen and a little irresponsible, right? And a little desperate. So you don't look at your best, right? This is not an easy thing to realize. I'm deeply sympathetic with the challenge that comes to a North American's, ordinary life when this realization comes flooding in. Eventually, I don't know how long it takes, but eventually you get the chance to begin to translate the understanding into a way of life that you don't have to wait until you're dying to live out. That's the magic. That's the alchemy. It's the act of translation. Listen, most of that stuff is work. I'm straight up. It's work. It's not inspiration. You're not walking around light as a feather. You know, everything's cool. You're good. None of that's true. No, the intermediate time is a hard time. You've looked into the face of God for a second when you realize you're going to die. And you realize there's no debate, baby. There's no back and forth. You don't get a vote. Okay. How are you going to translate that now? Okay. So it's not a bad way to spend your weekend, you know, contending with all those things, really and honestly. I mean, whatever you might think of me at this juncture in our talk here, one thing you can't accuse me of is being depressed. You'd never stick. And I've seen all this shit that I'm saying to you, and I've lived it out as best as I can. And I go through it again and again and again. And I'm not depressed. I'm telling you, that's not what it does to you. But it does make you want to be alive. I can promise you that. And it's not clear what that's supposed to be anymore. But it does give you a sense of urgency where you were fairly casual before. And that's why you're kind of a drag at parties, because you're a little too urgent, right? And things are a little too clear. And it's not easy to be in the presence of people for whom this is a drag. They don't need it. You're a drag, and so forth.
Yeah, that a lot of this resonates for me, and you know, it's still embedded in the dominant Western culture. But a lot of what you're saying, I feel like this kind of understanding is starting to seep through the cracks in certain communities. And I see this in, you know, in some of the psychedelic and spiritual communities that I'm a part of, in some of the circling and authentic relating communities, where a lot of it is about speaking your truth and about speaking what is real and what is uncomfortable. And that goes back to that kind of small talk when we go to a party and everybody's talking about these kind of surface level things. And I started noticing this for myself, that I would just not have the capacity for that. Like I don't feel like there's time to talk about stuff that's meaningless and to have relationships that are meaningless. And there is this sense of not everybody welcomes that kind of
Sure.
You have that kind of intensity, right? Like I experienced that intensity with you. Like I've seen a lot of interviews with you, and I've read your book, and I'm here with you now, and I feel that intensity, and not everybody likes that kind of intensity, because it puts us to that edge. It puts us to, let's talk about what's here right now. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. Instead of talking about sports or something else that's kind of moving us away. It's moving us away from what is real or what's a deeper level of truth in this moment.
If I may interject here,
please.
I don't think it's a question of subject matter. Okay. Yeah. In other words, I think there has to be a way of, to use your example, of talking about sports where everything we've just been talking about is real and present. There has to be. If there isn't, we just have these apartheids of subject matter, right? And here's the shitty stuff that doesn't matter. And so forget about that. And that means you're going to throw a lot of people in that mix too, because that's what they talk about. So they're gone and they're done. And you're superior. You see where it heads real quick.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that. I don't believe you're saying that either. What I'm saying instead is something much closer to this. This sense of urgency that you well described, emanated from me, doesn't come from my personality type. Come from what I saw. Okay? And what I saw radiated me. And this is radiation you're hearing, right? And I mean, I saw it and I was never able to unsee it again. Okay. And it's there always. It's in my way of seeing. Let me say that again. What I saw has turned into a way of seeing. It's not a subject anymore. It's a way of regarding things, right? Okay. So the consequence has to be, if this is useful to anybody else, the acts of translation are the acts of understanding. Okay, I got a teacup here in my hand. I don't know if the light is favorable for you to make out the imagery.
Skulls. Yeah, I can see
There
it.
you go. Okay. So what's up with that? Except a little product placement for what we're talking about here. Answer is, when I'm having my sustenance, especially first thing in the morning, I could get used to that. But every once in a while, I'll see it again. And here's these skulls looking right at me saying, brother, don't wander too far away now. We don't want to have to come and get you. In 1,000 different ways it says that. This is not a bad, memory aid to have. So you say, well, you're just talking about making tea. I am, and I'm not. If you make tea as if you're going to die, something changes. If you drink tea, if you pour tea as if you're going to die, something changes. It has to change. And you're going to have to hold up your old life like this to prevent it from changing. You're going to be fighting the change. And that's, we understand this is not an easy time. But the transition to this messing with you and having its way with you is a transition that, the world's mythologies have been trying to describe and advocate for and program for sure. All the wisdom traditions, right? Even the religions in their earliest times were devoted to this kind of translation. So we're not alone, and we're not the first ones. And we may be amongst history's most lost, possibly, but I'm not sure that puts us 20,000 miles out of reach. I think these things are doable within the ordinariness of a person's lifetime. And that's the responsibility we have to assume, I think, right? And that's why I call this thing, this is mostly perspiration, man, with a little bit of inspiration. This is mostly work, right? And that's what praying fundamentally is. When you see this kind of stuff, is work translated into something observable and consequential in the ordinary life, because that's where it happens. This is not peak experience stuff I'm advocating for. This is ordinary life being blessed with this understanding that it's not going to last. That is a blessing, but it's a challenging blessing. P.S. We misapprehend blessing as only good stuff. That's not what blessing means. The word blessing comes from the old Germanic word for blood. So blessing was literally understood when the word was first coined as a consequence of offerings, of blood offerings being made. In other words, if a blessing is bestowed, blood has been spilled. Translation, there's a consequence to blessing. It's a deeply challenging thing for an uninhabited, casual life. And one of the casualties is going to be your ability to live a casual life anymore. If you're smart, that's what you'll pay for it.
I'd like to talk about hope. And okay. Hope is one of the it seems like it's one of the bedrock values in Western culture. And many psychologists speak about how important hope is for one's health and well-being.
Sure.
And it seems like you have a slightly different outlook on hope. So how do you see or understand hope?
Our entire talk could have been devoted to this one thing. That's how vast it is. So I have to do it very much on the short. But the gist of it is this, it's clear that, I'm on the record now as officially declaring that being hopeful and being hopeless are not two opposites. They're twins. They're very close. Okay. What's the point? My point is both of them depend on hope. Hopeful depends on hope, obviously, but hopeless depends on hope too, just as much. In order to be hopeless, you got to have experimented with hope and found it a failure. See what I'm saying? It still has to be there. So I have an alternative, such as it is. I'm not much of a program guy, but for, you know, at the risk of sounding like I have one in this case, my idea is hope free, which is not a portion of either one of those two. It just opts out. It says, look, man, I tried being hopeful. It was interesting. It had its moments, you know, but God Almighty, it was doomed much more often than not. Okay, so then I tried hopeless. Nobody ever says it that way, but let's say it that way. I tried hopeless, tried it on, fit pretty good, especially after hope didn't work out. The natural thing to do, seemed like the responsible thing to do, seemed like I knew finally what I was doing when I was hopeless. Yeah, except there's something about hopeless that kept, like it was like the spin cycle that never ended. You know, it didn't turn into anything. Hopeless begets hopeless. That's how it goes. Hopeless seeks out hopeless, right? You make a support group called Hopeless, and that's what you trade in every Monday night or whatever it is. So how about this? I tried hopeful, I tried hopeless. They each had their compulsions and their attractions and their uses. That's true. But it was a con, because the idea was everything is either one of those or the other of those. Everything can be understood as either the presence of one of them or the absence of the other. Hope free, on the other hand, hope free says, man, I tried them both. I gave them a fair shot, you know, and something occurred to me that I didn't require hope in order to proceed. I know that's the party line, that you got to have hope, and then people won't finish the sentence. So I would often ask them, you got to have hope for what? Or you got to be hopeful. I said, no, finish the sentence. That is a finished sentence from the point of view of being hopeful, isn't it? It has its own reasons, doesn't it? It just works, doesn't it? It's like a sharp dressed man. It just works. You don't have to elaborate as to why. No, you should. You should try. You got to be hopeful, or else what? Or else you'd be hopeless. Baby, if you are a hopeful person, you will be hopeless sooner or later. Isn't that how it goes? You know that's how it goes. And you go back and forth between them, and you call that progress. It's Donkey Kong or whatever. What was that old freaking crazy video game, the early one? Whatever it was. That's what that is. Okay. So I'm saying this, you know, we're in an insanely troubled time. I mean, you can barely keep your wits about you. You pay attention to any kind of news feed, you go out of your mind. So now you look for all kinds of distractions as an antidote to the news feed, and now you go out of your mind, and so on and so on. Okay, so you got to stay hopeful. Really? To do what? What's being hopeful doing for you now? It's a crazy time. It's not an antidote to the crazy time. If you're a real citizen, which is what I'm pleading for now, not an opt-out specialist, a citizen now, that means you're in, right? That means we can count on you for the heavy lifting. Do you got to be hopeful to be a citizen of a troubled time? It sounds like you do until you start wondering about that got to part. Can you do the heavy lifting without hope? Not hopeless, hope free. Can you do the work and not ask to be paid first? Because that's what hope is. Hope says, I got to feel positive about the outcome, or I'm not going to work on behalf of the outcome. That's hope. It doesn't sound hopeful, but that's how hope actually works. Got to be hopeful first. Got to have the upside in view, right? Got to be positive. But wait, we're in the shit. What do you mean we got to be positive? I'm positive we're in the shit. Is that what you mean? No. Positive is an alternative to being in the shit. No, it isn't. It's truancy, right? So how do you occupy your God, if I can use the phrase, your God-given place in the shit? Because we're in it now. By the accident of birth, we're in it. It's never been like this for near as I can tell, right? How confounding it is. to keep your bearings and imagine what a properly, deeply well-lived life could possibly be in a time like this. You don't need hope to get your bearings. What you need is a willingness to occupy the fact that you were born to a troubled time. You see, maybe that's not an accident. Maybe that's not what your generation call random. You know, one of the favorite words I keep hearing. Random is like, maybe it's not random that you were born to a troubled time. And maybe it's not punishment either for bad karma. Maybe being born to a troubled time means that the troubles of your times needed the likes of you. Maybe that's what it means. Maybe the troubles of the times stand a chance of being ameliorated because the likes of you were born to them. And if you're willing to take up the citizen's work, maybe the troubles of your times, maybe they take a little bit of a hit for a change. See, that's the plea I make. I'm saying this to you, and I feel a lump in my throat to say it. Okay, speaking of urgency, but I mean this more deeply than I can say. Maybe being born to a time like this is not affliction for us. Maybe it's an assignment. You can undertake that understanding absolutely free of hope. You don't need it to be able to proceed. Case closed. Next case.
Yeah, it's really powerful framing, and I hope that people can sit with that. To me, it's like the feeling is like this too. Like this is life too. It's not wrong. Like this is the time. This is what's happening. Corona's here, the lockdowns, all of these things, whatever is going on in, in war in Ukraine and whatever is going on in people's personal lives. This too is a part of it. This is not a time that I'm going to wait for this to pass. Hopefully things will get better. Like, no, this is right now. This is it. Like, this is it. Whatever it is.
How about this? How about this? You're making memories that you're going to have by how you proceed right now. I got a band, you may know, and we're trying to get on the road again this year. We're just trying to put a tour together now. But we made a couple of records in the interim, since the pandemic come on. And one of them is called Fate. It's a 4-part one. I'm very, very proud of it. And it begins like this. See if I remember it now. Hey, what time is it? It's the Anthropocene, baby. That's what they're calling it. That means that we're everywhere. That means our spirit prints are on everything. That means wherever we go, there we are. We can't get away from us. That's how it starts. And it's a meditation on fate. Fate means the fix is in. No, that's not what the word means. Fate comes to us from Latin, right? And Latin people of the day had an understanding of the gods that went something like this. The world was made by the gods speaking it into existence. So literally the world was built in its material reality from words. You see, speaking of words, that's how we started, I think, an hour or so ago.
Yeah.
So the world was made by the gods speaking. Okay. And what do we call that today? Well, we call it gravity, evaporation, photosynthesis, all the physics, all the chemistry. That's the gods speaking. The trees growing up and not down, all the great ordinary mysteries that we're surrounded by every day. That's the gods having spoken. Here's what it never forecloses upon. Now that the gods have spoken, what shall you do? The gods don't foretell that. They don't predetermine that. That's on you. You see, that's what fate means. Fate means your actions are going to be undertaken in the presence of what the gods have said. You're not free from that. You're free in that. You're free because of that. But it doesn't mean you're free, consequence-free. Quite the opposite. You're surrounded by nothing but the consequences that you spin out into the world by virtue of what you say and don't say and do and don't do and all the rest, right? We can't get away from us. It could sound like a terrible kind of death sentence, or it could sound like, man, the opportunities for things to be otherwise are about as far away as you can reach. That's where they are. You don't have to go to the ends of the world. You don't have to go to the Amazon. You don't have to go anywhere you think is better than this. Because I promise you this, if you go there in hopes of things being better, everything that was wrong with your home place, you will bring with you. See, you're powerless in that regard. So save your money and save the Amazon and stay the hell home and do your work in your backyard. You want to help the world? That's the only place you're going to be able to do it. Whatever's at hand, you see. So you don't need great dispensation from the great beyond and a great deliverance of some massive radical realization and reformulation of the whole operation. What you need is something like this. Did you wake up this morning? I believe I did. Okay. Did you roll out of bed more or less unaided? Did you? Yeah. Why are you asking me this? Because I'm telling you that shit's not going to last. Okay. Pretty soon, sooner than you think, you're going to need help to get out of there. And then sooner than you think, no matter how much help you get, you won't get out of there. Now, look, that could sound pretty grim. Okay. But it's not true now. It's not true of your moment now, is it? No. So you live between now and then with the distinct possibility that your ability to act in the present moment comes in part from your understanding that you won't get a chance to do this forever. So baby, how should I put this? Operationalize, okay? Right now, you know, as that great No Doubt song says, what you waiting for? But really answer the question. Are you waiting? Are you waiting for a better day? Are you waiting for a fairer shake? Are you waiting for the gods to smile upon you? Are you waiting for the whole social justice thing to become socially just immediately? And then you're free to proceed. You're waiting for somebody to look you in the eye and say, you're the best possible thing the world has been waiting for. Is that what you're waiting for? You see, so it's throwdown, isn't it? You can tell by the way I'm saying it. For those people who are on the sidelines waiting for things to be better, I'm saying, come on, man, don't leave all the work to us. You're more needed than you wish you were. All right. And the allegations of your loneliness are overstated. So you got to stand and deliver because that's what time it is. Yeah, we're in a troubled time. And you know, the people to come in 2 or 3 generations from now are going to be living out their lives in the presence of what you did and what you didn't do. So what do you wish for them? Because you're in the position of delivering on what you wish for them. And that's what it means to wake up in the morning and roll out of bed and put your feet down on the floor and put your pants on one leg at a time. That's where it comes from. I'll never get elected based on that stuff, but I think it's so.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying the hard things, and you know, your popularity probably is taking a hit, you know, because of speaking on the things that you speak and speaking these hard truths. But somebody's got to do it. So I'm glad that you've stepped into that so well. I guess what I wanted to ask you also is, through your work in palliative care, have you come across people that seem to be completely accepting of their death? And if so, what was it in their understanding of death that was different than most other people?
Honestly, I mean, I know you, and you know that you didn't invent the word accept as the kind of the gold standard of dying well. It literally comes from a book called On Death and Dying, and it establishes as the apex experience for people who are dying. If you can get to acceptance, you know, the golden road is before you, right? Okay. And I understand the attraction. Okay. But I can tell you with a clear conscience, I never oblige anybody I work with who is dying to accept their dying. No. Why? Because generally the only way people could find a way to accept their dying was to translate it as a kind of anti-life position to take. They had to be done with life. They had to swear off life. They had to stop loving being alive. They had to turn away from all that. They had to face and embrace it, and on and on. Here's the thing. I can tell you from personal experience that one of the consequences of seeing your death for real is a spike in your desire to be alive. A spike. So what does acceptance look like now when that's happening in your marrow, in your bones? And it's undeniable, and it's real, and it belongs. See, the absolutism of acceptance doesn't allow that stuff in. So can you be dying and loving being alive at the same time? Not if you're on the acceptance train, you probably can't. But if you're lucky enough to be around somebody who introduces this idea to you as something that's not two opposites colliding, that in actual fact, you could say one very devout way of dying is to love being alive as your living begins to cease. You don't have to choose for that not to be true. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just saying it's good. So, you see, I'm quibbling with the terms of your question and therefore not answering it in the way that you've asked me. But what would that look like if you saw somebody do it? It's fitful, man. It's not like you get there and then you're just there and you're there permanently. That's not what happens. I mean, you might glimpse this on a Tuesday afternoon. By Thursday, it's all gone, right? Because you had another bout of pain or because you shit yourself and you're just so humiliated, or you see what I'm saying? I mean, you got to let this stuff in as a proper understanding that a realization is not an insurance policy, that now that you've got it, you'll always have it. This stuff comes and goes, doesn't it? And so it helps if you can begin to craft a language where these realities actually appear, and you can speak this, you can talk the talk of it, even when you're hurt, okay? Even when you're incontinent, right? Even when you're scared, you can talk the talk. And doing so, it's like that rubbing stone in your pocket. You can touch it again by saying it, see? And you're not cheerleading yourself, and you're not allowing yourself to be cheerled by well-intended other people. You're saying, please don't talk me out of my dying. Okay? Join me in it, but don't seduce me away from it. Maybe that's what it looks like.
And then that makes me think of, if somebody's listening to this right now and they're dealing with, I mean, we're all dying, but let's say death to them is a lot more intimate, like they're dealing with somebody that a loved one is dying.
Yeah.
How can they hold that space? What can they do, or how can they be that's most supportive for
the people who are giving the care, you mean?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Well, okay, this is a great question. We're going to have to end on this one.
Yeah.
Because the angels of time are threatening to leave the house, right?
Yes.
Okay. So you could think of it this way. Let's say you love somebody who's dying. I hope that's true. That might be true for a good number of people who might be tuned into this, after we've done it, and if it has any kind of, shelf life. And you may think, and it would be understandable if you did think this, that your best way of loving them is to love them in spite of the fact that they're dying. That is, your love, just goes around, just bypasses their dying altogether. And that you're going to be positive and hopeful and supportive and all that other stuff. And that would be an understandable, but frankly, a beginner's mistake. Because here's what I want to say. I began with the formulation. Let's say you love somebody who's dying. So the operational word there is love. Okay. Now you might have come to the idea that what love is an unchangeable thing in a changing world. And I've just spent the last hour trying to make the case that that's not what it is. That if love is not changeable, it doesn't belong in a changing world. It has no use in a changing world. So how about this? You used to love so-and-so as a living person, right? Translation, you love so-and-so as if you had a future in order to do this loving in, right? And it's the future that gave you room to do your thing. Okay, so guess what's happened? Terminal diagnosis come in, and that future is gone without a trace, and it's not coming back. So what does your love look like now? Well, if you're not careful, you're going to hold on to that old understanding of life, of love, that resists and refuses the dying. Or you could understand, honey, your understanding of love itself has to die. Your old understanding of love has to die with the diagnosis, you see. And what can come in its place is a revolutionized or radicalized understanding of love, wherein you know that your love of this person will not extend their days but one by one, and shouldn't be able to do so. And so what's it for now, if it's not to obtain increase? Can you love in a dying fashion, a dying person? Can your love ebb as the person who you love is ebbing? Can it be faithful that way? Or are you going to use it as a rock? See? So you could either imagine your love is a river around the stone of somebody who's dying, or you could understand your love as the whole picture, the river moving, the stone in its midst, you trying to find a way around the stone without shipwrecking, right? All the white water, how you going to handle all that situation? The fact that the white water doesn't last forever, because the bottom rocks, they mellow out after a while, and it's just a current now and not white water after all, and you don't have to fight. See, but you're not going back where you were. You're not going upstream. You're being borne along by something that's older and bigger and wiser than you. And that's what life is, especially life unto death. That's what it is. And it doesn't mean you any harm, but it means you. And you're not left out of the life parade after all. And you're not as lonely as you think. And you belong now, don't you? This is what a belonging person feels like. You're included in the time parade. And there are moments you wish you weren't, but you are. I go by that story. I get behind that understanding. I've been behind it the whole time I'm talking to you. Everything I'm saying to you basically come from there. I don't have a party line on anything. I'm not trying to sell anything to anybody. I'm faithfully and in good faith answering the questions that you're asking me. And I'm doing so because I know there's stuff that's at stake. I know it's difficult. I know it asks things of you that will never be asked of you before that moment. I know that. Okay. So this is one voice who's trying to give you a feel for the terrain just before you get in the water. Just before you start going uphill, just before the bottom seems to fall out. So that when it happens, see, I'm not saying this so to make sure it doesn't happen. I'm saying it so when it does happen, you get to remember at least one person said, so here's how this goes. There's going to be this. It's not going to be what you think. You're not going to be ready and you won't get over it. Okay. But there's other things too. And they're equally true. And they're not all defeated and disastrous like wreckage by the side of the road. And I know that stuff helps in the clutch, at crunch time. I know it does. It just doesn't help in the way that we're looking forward to. See, so here's the final PS on the thing. I was there, see. The stuff you're hearing from me doesn't come from my opinions or my attitudes or my upbringing or my nationality or my racial designation or any of that other stuff. I was there, right? Doesn't make me an expert, but it does make me a witness. So that's what you're hearing. I got no reason to misrepresent this stuff to you. I got no reason to overstate it, understate it, promise you stuff that's not true, or take away stuff from you that is. Right? A lot of people died on my watch, and they entrusted their dying to me. And I'm keeping the faith with them by talking to you the way I am.
Stephen, it's been a beautiful conversation. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing some of your wisdom. Just wondering, where can people connect with you? And what's going on next with you? If there's anything else you want to mention. I know you brought up the project you're doing with the singer Gregory Hoskins. Yeah. So
yeah. So, well, thanks for asking. There's a couple of things. I mean, it's going to sound a little anticlimactic after what I just said. But we have a school, the Orphan Wisdom School, that's been going for about 11 or so years now. It's taken a little hiatus for the obvious reasons last couple of years, but I believe we're on again if the creek don't rise and, and the gods don't decide otherwise. And there's still some opening for people who want to join that thing called the Orphan Wisdom School. And then we're trying to put a tour together, as I mentioned, a little bit in Europe at the end of sort of late spring, early summer, and then a major tour in North America in the fall, hopefully, called Nights of Grief and Mystery. That's the name of the project. We don't have a name for the band, which confounds the customs guys to Kingdom Come, you know. Say the guy literally said to me one time when I was going to the States, he said, wait a minute. He said, what's this grief and mystery thing? I said, well, that's the name of what we do. He said, you mean to tell me that people pay to come to something called grief and mystery? And I said to him, I know, I don't understand it either, man. And he was disgusted. He said, just go. So they let me in based on that crazy thing. So we have that, and it's a proper, you could say it's what you've just been hearing for the last hour, to a fairly kick-ass groove. And those two things really belong together if you do it right. And it's a beautiful night. Yeah. So between those two things, that might be the rest of my 2022. If I'm lucky, I'll get to do them. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to it. And I hope you touch down in New York. If you do, hopefully we'll get to cross paths and I'll get to be a witness to this process.
Amen. Well, the only way it works is we got to have, co-conspirators on the ground. And we work with local organizers, and we don't work with promoters and like that, right? So it's a real grassroots deal. And the people who step forward to make an event in their hometown, we say they're writing a love letter to where they live by that kind of work. And we're just the ink on the love letter when we come and do the show. So that's how it would happen. If you want to put your paddle in the water, that's how we could be there. So we could talk about that another time if you'd like.
Yeah, for sure.
Listen, I really appreciate the invitation here, man. And I believe we did something that was worthy of being considered. So thank you. Thank you for the invitation to do that.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Stephen.
All right. Bless you.
Yeah.